I never imagined that living in a quiet suburban neighborhood would one day feel like a trap, a gilded cage monitored by someone who believed the rules mattered more than human life. Our street in a modest, middle-class suburb in the USA looked perfect from the outside. Well-manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, white picket fences, and pastel-colored houses lined up like a postcard. But behind the facades, tension simmered, and in our house, the anxiety always lingered because of my daughter, Emily. Emily was 12, with the brightest smile and the sweetest laugh, but her life was different from other kids her age. She was born with a congenital heart condition that left her lungs weaker than most children's. She struggled with respiratory issues, especially during spring pollen season, when even a short walk could leave her gasping for air. Our home had to be adapted to her condition. Oxygen tanks were always on standby, air purifiers hummed quietly in every room, and I had to monitor her activity constantly. We had routines to protect her, but in some ways, routines weren't enough to shield her from the world outside. Our neighborhood had a homeowners association, or HOA, which was initially presented as a safety net for property values and communal harmony. At first, it seemed harmless. A few rules about paint colors, lawn care, and parking. But the HOA had a chairperson, whom everyone unofficially called Karen, whose interpretation of the rules was absolute. She wore the authority like armor and carried it with a smug sense of righteousness. To her, the rules were never guidelines, they were commandments. It started small, notices about a slightly crooked garden gnome, complaints about our recycling bins being out an extra day, or subtle comments about Emily's adaptive equipment cluttering the driveway. We tried to comply, thinking it was easier to bend than break. But Karen's scrutiny never ended. She seemed to patrol the neighborhood on a personal mission, documenting minor infractions as if each one was a criminal act. The escalation was slow but relentless. As a parent, I tried to explain to Emily that some people were unkind, that not everyone understood her needs. But kids notice more than we think. She would watch me read emails from the HOA and say, with wide eyes, "Mom, why do they hate me?" It was heartbreaking because it wasn't personal in a traditional sense. Karen didn't know Emily personally, but her rigid obsession with rules created a hostile environment that affected our lives daily. Despite the growing tension, life in the neighborhood had its moments. Children played on the cul-de-sac, neighbors chatted over fences, and the sense of community was palpable. But it always came with an undercurrent of fear. Fear that the HOA could intervene, criticize, or punish, even for minor, inconsequential things. That fear, once a whisper, grew louder as Karen began targeting us more aggressively. I had always been meticulous about Emily's health. I tracked her oxygen levels, had a portable oxygen concentrator ready for trips, and never let her engage in anything that might trigger a breathing episode. But the emotional stress the HOA caused was something no amount of medical preparation could prevent. Stress is a silent killer for someone with respiratory challenges, and Karen seemed to understand that on some instinctive level, or perhaps she didn't care. Our confrontation with her was inevitable. A warm afternoon in May, the air rich with pollen, saw Emily outside, helping me plant flowers near the front porch. She was wearing her little portable oxygen unit, which made the task slower but safe. I noticed Karen standing across the street, arms crossed, her expression carved in disapproval. She walked over, clicking heels on the sidewalk, a tangible aura of judgment. "You need to remove that," she said, pointing at Emily's oxygen tubing. "It's unsightly, and it violates community aesthetics." I blinked, momentarily speechless. "Her oxygen is essential. She can't be outside without it," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "There are rules. You can't flaunt medical devices in front of everyone. It's disturbing to the community standards. You should have notified the HOA." I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her and make her understand that this wasn't a matter of choice, that Emily's very life depended on this oxygen. But Karen was immovable. Her rules were her reality. She left a notice on our door that day, stating that our violation needed correction or we would face fines. That was the moment I realized our nightmare was about to spiral out of control. Over the following weeks, tension escalated. Emily became anxious when she saw Karen outside, hiding her oxygen tubing and playing indoors more to avoid confrontation. Her anxiety began manifesting physically, shallow breaths, coughing fits, and nights waking up gasping. Every interaction with Karen or reading a new HOA letter felt like a potential trigger. Our home, once a sanctuary, had turned into a battlefield where survival meant compliance with rules that defied common sense and compassion. That was the beginning of the storm. We had no idea that the next encounter would escalate into a crisis, one that would test the limits of patience, courage, and parental instinct, and leave a lasting mark on our family. After that first notice from Karen, life in our neighborhood felt like walking a tightrope. Every step Emily or I took outside was measured, calculated, and anxiety-inducing. The irony was that the HOA, which claimed to promote community harmony, had created an environment filled with stress, fear, and humiliation. For Emily, who already had fragile lungs and anxiety stemming from her medical condition, this constant pressure was more than psychological, it was physical. Karen's obsession didn't slow down. She started issuing formal complaints about things that had never been a problem before. Emily's adaptive swing in the backyard, the portable ramp we had installed to help her navigate the front steps, even the garden hose that I left coiled on the side of the driveway. Each complaint came with language designed to intimidate. Threats of fines, mentions of legal action, and warnings that persistent violations could result in liens on our home. I tried to reason with her. I emailed, I called, I pleaded for a human perspective. Please, she has a medical condition, I wrote in one email, attaching Emily's pediatrician's letter explaining her respiratory vulnerability. These items are essential for her health and safety. Karen's response was chillingly formal and void of empathy. The rules apply to all residents equally. Your personal circumstances do not exempt you from compliance. Adjust your property accordingly. It was as if empathy was a foreign concept to her. Her fixation on rules had stripped away any recognition of reality. That Emily was a vulnerable child whose well-being could not be compromised for aesthetic conformity. The message was clear. Compliance mattered more than life itself. The tension reached its peak one afternoon during a neighborhood meeting. Karen had called a special session, ostensibly to review community standards, but I knew it was directed squarely at me. The HOA clubhouse smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee as neighbors filed in, some curious, some apprehensive. Karen stood at the front, clipboard in hand, radiating authority. Some residents have been non-compliant with HOA guidelines, she announced, scanning the room, her eyes finally landing on me. It is our duty to ensure that all homes adhere to community standards. Exceptions create chaos and set dangerous precedents. I felt my stomach tighten. My voice wavered as I responded. I'm here to talk about my daughter. She has a serious medical condition. The things you're calling violations, oxygen tubing, ramps, adaptive swings, they're necessary for her health and safety. She could die without them. A murmur ran through the room. Some neighbors looked uncomfortable, but Karen's expression did not change. Her voice was sharp, surgical in its detachment. Rules exist for the greater good. Individual exceptions cannot dictate community policy. Your daughter's situation, while unfortunate, does not negate the community's right to uniformity. Uniformity. The word echoed in my mind. It sounded so innocuous, almost civil, but the effect was anything but. In that moment, I realized that Karen's world was binary, compliant or non-compliant, obedient or rebellious. There was no room for nuance, no room for compassion. After that meeting, Karen intensified her surveillance. She began leaving notes on our door almost daily. This item must be removed, violation not corrected, final notice before fine. Emily started hiding inside whenever she saw Karen's car, her small body trembling with anxiety. Even brief trips outside became triggers, shallow breaths, tightness in her chest, coughing fits. I tried to shield her. We adjusted routines, limited outdoor time, and kept her oxygen unit within easy reach. But the psychological strain began manifesting in physical symptoms. Emily's breathing became erratic at times, especially when she thought she was in trouble or when she anticipated confrontation. She would clutch her chest and say, "Mom, I can't breathe," and my heart would drop every time. One Saturday, it all came to a head. Karen had parked across the street while Emily and I were planting flowers near the porch, a therapeutic activity meant to help her feel normal. She marched over immediately, clipboard in hand, a scowl on her face. "You're still violating community standards," she said, pointing at the portable oxygen tank. "Remove it immediately." Emily's eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. I tried to calm her while keeping my voice steady. "Karen, please, this is for her health. She can't go without it." Karen leaned in slightly, her tone a mixture of irritation and smug superiority. "Excuses don't override the rules. You must comply." It was at that moment that Emily's oxygen saturation began dropping. I noticed the telltale signs: rapid, shallow breathing, panic in her eyes, lips turning slightly blue. My chest tightened, a surge of adrenaline flooding my system. "Emily, come here, now," I said, scooping her up. Her body was trembling, her hands clutching my shirt. I fumbled for the portable oxygen concentrator, struggling to attach the nasal cannula as she gasped for air. Karen, rather than stepping back, seemed almost fascinated by the scene. Her arms crossed, she looked like a referee watching a sports game. "Is she really that fragile?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Perhaps this is an exaggeration. I wanted to scream. The words died in my throat as I realized Emily was truly struggling. Panic gave way to instinct. I ignored Karen completely, strapped Emily into the wheelchair, oxygen flowing, and rushed toward the car. Every second felt like an eternity. I could hear Karen's voice behind me, shouting something about fines and violations, but it was nothing compared to the sound of my daughter's labored breathing. Neighbors were emerging from their homes now, drawn by the commotion. Some looked concerned, others confused, and a few even shook their heads at Karen's audacity. But I couldn't process them. Emily's life was in my hands, and I had to get her to a hospital immediately. The drive was frantic. Emily's small body trembled in my arms, oxygen saturations fluctuating, and I whispered reassurances I barely felt. I called ahead to the emergency room, explaining her condition and that we were en route. The minutes crawled by, each one a nail-biting reminder of how fragile life can be when bureaucracy and rigidity collide with human vulnerability. When we finally arrived, I could barely navigate the hospital doors, adrenaline still surging. Nurses rushed to her side as I explained everything: the breathing difficulties, the underlying medical condition, the stress from the neighborhood incident. Emily was immediately put on supplemental oxygen, her vitals monitored, and I sat beside her, gripping her hand, feeling every shallow breath she took as if it were my own. It was in that moment, watching her struggle for air while recalling Karen's cold admonitions, that I realized the true danger of unchecked authority. It wasn't just about fines, rules, or garden aesthetics. It was about human life. And for the first time, I understood how precarious the balance between rigid governance and compassion can be, and how devastatingly destructive it can become when one person prioritizes rules over the vulnerable. That day left scars, not just on Emily, but on all of us. It made the HOA conflict no longer an annoyance or a bureaucratic nuisance. It became a threat to health, safety, and sanity. And as I sat in the hospital waiting room, exhausted and angry, I knew that the battle with Karen and her obsession was far from over. It had escalated beyond property lines and fines. It was now a fight for dignity, empathy, and the right to protect a child's life in the face of unreasonable authority. The moment we arrived at the hospital, the world felt both urgent and unreal. The automatic doors slid open, and I practically ran with Emily in my arms, the small oxygen concentrator clutched against her fragile body. Her breaths were shallow and rapid, a harsh whistle in her chest with every inhale. I could feel her tiny frame trembling uncontrollably, and panic clawed at my throat. A triage nurse rushed toward us, her expression calm but urgent. "What's happening?" she asked, taking the oxygen monitor from my hands. "She's struggling to breathe. She has a congenital heart condition," and my voice broke. I wanted to explain everything at once. The HOA confrontation, the stress, the physical triggers. But the words tumbled out incoherently, desperate and fragmented. The nurse guided Emily to a bed, snapping the pulse oximeter on her finger. The reading blinked, 82% oxygen saturation. My heart nearly stopped. For a child with a chronic respiratory condition, anything below 90% was dangerous. The monitor beeped steadily, and I watched Emily's chest rise and fall so rapidly I feared it might never slow down. A respiratory therapist immediately arrived, attaching a higher flow oxygen mask. Emily flinched at first, her small hands clutching mine. I whispered gently, "It's okay, sweetie. Breathe, mommy's here, you're safe." She clung to me like I was her lifeline, and I held her close, feeling her fragile heartbeat against my chest. Meanwhile, the doctor came in, reviewing the notes I had brought with me. "Stress-induced exacerbation," she murmured, more to herself than to me. Then, looking up, she said, "Her oxygen levels dropped rapidly. We need to monitor her closely and stabilize her." How long was she exposed to stress? I hesitated, my chest tightening. There's someone at our HOA. She keeps enforcing rules that endanger Emily." She confronted us while Emily was outside. It triggered her breathing. My words tumbled out, panic overriding any sense of composure. The doctor's expression hardened, a mixture of disbelief and concern. Emotional stress can absolutely cause a life-threatening respiratory episode in a child like hers. You did the right thing bringing her here immediately. For the next hour, the hospital became a blur of clinical precision. Nurses adjusted oxygen levels, monitored her vitals, and administered medications to reduce inflammation in her airways. Emily's breathing gradually stabilized, though every exhale was still shallow, as if each breath required effort and courage. I stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, murmuring words of comfort, and trying not to lose myself in fear. Somewhere in the background, I could hear the faint hum of the hospital, the distant beeps of monitors, the shuffle of nurses' shoes. And yet, in that room, nothing else existed except Emily's struggle for life and the crushing weight of the events that had led us there. I could feel my anger simmering beneath the fear. Karen's obsession with rules had pushed us to the edge. If I hadn't acted quickly, if I hadn't ignored her judgment and rushed my daughter here, I might have lost her. As Emily's condition slowly stabilized, the doctor pulled me aside. "I need to stress this," she said, her tone urgent. This was a serious event. Emotional stress in children with compromised respiratory function is not trivial. You need to minimize exposure to situations that could trigger this again. I nodded numbly, trying to digest the warning. My mind raced through every letter, every confrontation, every scolding from Karen. It all seemed so trivial: garden hoses, ramps, oxygen tubing. But it had escalated into a near-death experience. My child's life had been put at risk by bureaucracy masquerading as authority. The nurses continued monitoring Emily, adjusting her oxygen to a safe level. Her chest still heaved with effort, but the panic in her eyes began to fade. She was exhausted, drained from the ordeal, and I could see the relief mingled with lingering fear. She whispered softly, "Mom, I thought I couldn't breathe." "I know, baby, I know," I said, hugging her tightly. "But you're okay now. We're safe. I've got you." The hospital staff made me stay in the room with her, warning that any emotional upset could trigger another episode. For the next several hours, we remained there, Emily dozing intermittently, her oxygen mask still in place, my arms aching from holding her upright. Each time she stirred, I instinctively checked her breathing, my anxiety taut as a wire. I couldn't help thinking about Karen. While Emily fought for each breath, Karen's mind was likely focused on garden aesthetics, paint colors, and property fines. The stark contrast between her obsession with conformity and the life-or-death reality in front of me made my blood boil. How could someone value a mailbox alignment more than a child's breath? More than a child's life? The incident prompted me to consider my next steps. This wasn't just a personal family crisis anymore, it was a systemic problem. I needed to protect Emily not just physically but legally. The HOA's rigid rules and Karen's relentless enforcement had escalated to a point where negligence could have catastrophic consequences. I knew I would need documentation, medical records, witness statements, anything to establish the danger posed by this environment. As night fell and Emily finally rested more comfortably, I sat beside her, exhausted, feeling the weight of what had happened. I reflected on every detail of the day. Karen's scornful stare, her clipboard, her disregard for humanity. The irony was bitter. An organization meant to foster community had become a threat to the most vulnerable. I thought about the larger implications. Emily's episode was not just a private crisis. It was a warning about the potential dangers of rigid, uncompassionate authority, especially when wielded without accountability. HOA boards, which often function with little oversight, can wield real power over residents' lives. In our case, it almost turned deadly. By the next morning, Emily's vitals had stabilized, and the doctors cleared her for discharge with strict instructions to minimize stress and maintain close monitoring. I held her hand as we walked out of the hospital, exhausted but relieved. The sun was just rising, casting light over the city and reminding me that life continued, fragile as it was, even after such an ordeal. Driving home, I reflected on how quickly life could shift from normalcy to crisis. A garden hose, a portable oxygen tank, a swing in the backyard, small, mundane things that Karen had weaponized through her obsession with rules, had almost led to tragedy. I knew that the battle with her wasn't over, but Emily's safety had to come first. The emotional, legal, and social battle with the HOA would have to wait until I could ensure she would never again be left, barely breathing, due to bureaucracy masquerading as authority. As we pulled into the driveway, Emily asleep in her car seat with oxygen still gently flowing, I made a silent vow. No rule, no HOA fine, no neighborly scolding would ever take precedence over her health and well-being. I would fight, navigate, and protect her from the rigid structures of suburban governance if that's what it took. The crisis had been terrifying, but it had also crystallized a truth I could no longer ignore. Sometimes, life demands you break the rules to save someone you love. Returning home from the hospital, Emily asleep and oxygen running quietly beside her, I felt a strange combination of relief and lingering dread. Relief that she had survived what could have been a catastrophic episode, and dread because the danger wasn't over. It had simply shifted from immediate medical crisis to the ongoing tension with the HOA. Karen, the self-appointed arbiter of neighborhood aesthetics, had not gone away. She was still out there, clipboard in hand, enforcing rules as if life itself hung in the balance of her sense of propriety. The following days were a blur of recovery, paperwork, and emotional exhaustion. Emily's doctors prescribed stricter monitoring and recommended counseling to help her cope with the trauma. Even at home, she flinched at unexpected noises or any hint of confrontation, and I realized just how profoundly the ordeal had shaken her. Her world, once full of simple pleasures like gardening or playing outside, had been narrowed by fear and stilled not by illness alone, but by human cruelty disguised as rules. I spent hours documenting everything. Emails from Karen, notices left on our door, photos of the so-called violations, and medical records detailing Emily's emergency hospitalization. I wanted a record not just for myself, but in case this escalated further. The stress of HOA enforcement had crossed a line, and if Karen's obsession with rules endangered my child again, I needed to have evidence. Some neighbors reached out quietly, expressing sympathy but also wariness. "She's relentless," one whispered. "You did the right thing." Others avoided discussion entirely, afraid of drawing Karen's attention. I realized how insidious her power had become, an individual exerting disproportionate influence, cloaked in the legitimacy of an HOA board, capable of creating fear, anxiety, and even endangering lives. I also reached out to legal counsel. Many people underestimate the authority of an HOA, assuming it is just a bureaucratic nuisance. But when its enforcement jeopardizes a resident's health or safety, it crosses into territory that requires legal scrutiny. I wanted to ensure that Emily would never again be put in a situation where bureaucracy could literally take her breath away. The attorney advised compiling all documentation and, if necessary, challenging the HOA rules in court or seeking an injunction. It was a sobering reminder that even suburban neighborhoods are not immune to power dynamics that can spiral out of control. Emotionally, the ordeal left deep marks on our family. Emily's fear had not dissipated overnight, and I found myself more protective, perhaps overly so. Every noise, every knock on the door, every glance from a neighbor triggered caution. I had to balance vigilance with the need to allow Emily to live as normally as possible, a delicate dance I had never anticipated. And yet, despite the fear, there was also a sense of empowerment. We had survived a moment where rules and rigidity threatened life itself. We had acted decisively, and Emily was alive. That knowledge, fragile though it felt, was a source of strength. As for Karen, she continued to patrol the neighborhood, though her actions began to shift once the hospitalization became known. Rumors spread quietly among the neighbors about the incident. Whispers of, "Did you hear what happened?" and "They almost lost their child over a ramp," made their way into conversations. Karen, it seemed, had underestimated the impact of her behavior on the community's perception. Social pressure, even in a neighborhood structured around compliance, can have subtle consequences. Some neighbors began questioning her judgment, her relentless focus on minutiae, and her disregard for human welfare. I also took time to reflect on the larger implications. This was not just an isolated incident, it was a microcosm of a broader tension in American suburban life. HOAs exist to enforce standards, to maintain property values, and to regulate shared spaces. But when rules are enforced without compassion, without recognition of real-life circumstances, they can become oppressive. When the human element is stripped away, when authority is wielded rigidly, ordinary life can become a source of danger rather than security. Emily's crisis was proof of that. In the weeks that followed, we took deliberate steps to protect Emily. Her outdoor activities were scheduled during quieter hours, away from scrutiny. I made sure every oxygen tank, ramp, or adaptive device was in place, visible if necessary, but under the watchful eye of the community only if it came to confrontation. We practiced breathing exercises and coping strategies, preparing for the eventuality that Karen might escalate again. But more importantly, we focused on reclaiming our lives. Emily returned to her small joys, planting flowers, painting, and laughing again. The color slowly returned to our home and to our hearts. Ultimately, the ordeal taught me a painful but valuable lesson. Compassion must always take precedence over rigid enforcement, especially when lives are at stake. Rules exist to serve people, not to endanger them. And while HOAs can provide structure, when they operate without accountability or empathy, they can become instruments of harm. Emily's near tragedy was a stark reminder that human well-being must always be prioritized over appearances, conformity, and bureaucratic authority. The crisis also changed me. I became an advocate, not just for my daughter, but for families navigating similar struggles. I began attending HOA meetings armed with documentation, questions, and a firm voice, ensuring that other vulnerable families wouldn't face the same danger. My experience had illuminated a truth: vigilance, preparation, and courage are essential when bureaucracy threatens those who are defenseless. And as I watched Emily sleep one evening, her breathing steady, the small oxygen concentrator humming quietly beside her, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude that she had survived, that I had acted, and that we had faced the storm together. But I also carried a quiet anger, a recognition that a simple set of rules, enforced without humanity, could almost have cost us everything. Our story became a cautionary tale, shared quietly among neighbors, echoed in forums for parents of medically vulnerable children, and whispered among those living under strict HOAs. It was a reminder that while suburban rules may seem benign, they can carry hidden dangers when compassion is absent. In the end, Emily thrived. We rebuilt our sense of safety and normalcy. And I made a promise to myself, and to her: no rigid rule, no petty enforcement, no bureaucratic edict would ever outweigh the simple, undeniable truth that protecting life comes first. The HOA may have its rules, Karen may have her clipboard, but for us, life and breath, Emily's precious, fragile breath, remain the ultimate authority.